When I stepped out of the bathroom, the towel barely clinging to my skin, I didn't expect to find anyone standing in the hallway. Especially not him. The boy renting the upstairs room, with his sketchbooks and quiet eyes. Our eyes met for less than a second, but that moment stretched long enough for my heart to forget how to beat. I pulled the towel tighter, my knuckles whitening, and I wanted to disappear into the steam that still clung to my skin. He didn't say a word. He just turned away and closed the door behind him. But that silence echoed louder than a scream. I stood there, motionless, dripping water onto the wooden floor, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Just an accident. Just bad timing. But it wasn't. Because that night, I stood in front of the mirror, and for the first time in years, I saw myself, not just the age or the wrinkles or the loose skin. I saw someone who had been looked at, really looked at. And it terrified me. I had spent so many years being invisible, I had forgotten how it felt to be seen. My husband didn't even notice the towel on the floor the next morning. But I remembered. And that was the beginning of everything. The moment I wish I could forget, and the one I know I never will. 3 weeks from that day, everything I knew about myself, about marriage, about loyalty, it all cracked. So let me tell you how it happened, piece by piece, before you decide who to blame. But before I tell you the truth I've kept buried for so long, leave a comment with your age and where you're watching from, and tell me, have you ever crossed a line without meaning to, only to realize it was too late to go back? It started with silence. Not the kind that screams, not the kind born from fights or slammed doors. Ours was colder, the kind that forms slowly, like frost on windows, barely noticeable until you can't see through the glass anymore. My husband and I weren't unhappy. At least, not in any obvious way. We still shared meals. We still talked about bills, groceries, the news. But there was no warmth in the way he passed the salt, no brush of fingers when we handed each other cups of tea. We had become efficient. Civil, practical. Like colleagues sharing an office space rather than a life. I noticed it most in the mornings. He'd leave his mug in the sink, his shirt draped carelessly over the chair. I'd clean it up without a word. No kiss goodbye. No have a good day. I used to watch him walk to the car, waiting for him to glance back just once. He never did. Then came the ad. Just a small notice on the community board. Room for rent, quiet house, backyard access, shared kitchen. We didn't need the money, not really, but I suggested it anyway. Might be nice to have someone around, I said. He barely looked up from his phone. Your call, he muttered. I cleaned the guest room that afternoon. Washed the curtains. A part of me buzzed, though I couldn't explain why. He arrived with a worn-out suitcase, a canvas bag, and a shy smile. Mid-20s, maybe. Brown hair that fell into his eyes. Polite. Soft-spoken. Thank you for letting me stay, he said as I showed him the room. His voice had a quiet steadiness I hadn't heard in this house for a long time. I didn't think of him again until the bathroom door jammed 2 days later. It was an old latch. Sometimes it stuck, but never like this. I had just stepped out of the shower, the towel barely wrapped, steam still clinging to my skin. I tugged at the handle, nothing. No phone, no robe. I opened the door just a sliver, called out. And that's when he walked by. He froze. I froze. We looked at each other, and in that glance, something inside me shifted. Not desire. Not yet. But awareness. I was seen. He turned, mumbled something, I couldn't hear what, and vanished into his room. I stood there, heart racing, skin flushed with something far more dangerous than heat. I shut the door and pressed my back against it. My reflection in the fogged mirror looked different. Awake. Raw. Real. The next morning, I put on lipstick. Not red, too loud. A muted coral I hadn't worn in years. My husband didn't notice. But when the boy, I didn't even know his name then, walked into the kitchen and glanced at my face, I saw it. His gaze lingered. Just for a moment. Then he looked away. Polite, again. Respectful. But I felt it. That afternoon, I rearranged the books in the living room. Not because they needed it, but because I wanted the space to feel alive. As if something might happen there. I found a throw pillow I'd forgotten I owned. Floral, soft. I placed it carefully on the armchair by the window. Later that week, I saw him sketching in the backyard. He didn't notice me watching from the kitchen. His lines were quick, assured. Focused. I hadn't seen someone concentrate like that in so long, not on me, not on anything in our house. My husband used to take photos when we were younger. He used to capture light on my face like it mattered. One evening, I heard soft footsteps coming downstairs. It was late. I was in the kitchen, nursing tea I didn't want. He appeared in the doorway, holding a mug. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to bother you." I smiled. "You're not bothering me." It was the first real conversation we'd had. We talked about books. Nothing deep. Nothing personal. Just names and covers, favorite authors. But there was warmth in the way he listened. He asked questions. He nodded. He remembered titles I mentioned. My husband hadn't asked me about a book in years. He left first. Said goodnight. I stood there long after he'd gone upstairs, watching the steam curl from my mug. That night, I lay in bed beside a man I'd known for over 2 decades. His back to me, already half asleep. I reached out, almost touched his shoulder. But I stopped. My hand hovered in the dark. Then fell. The next morning, I found myself standing too long in front of my closet. I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in years. Soft fabric. A gentle neckline. Not revealing, but not hiding either. I caught my reflection. I looked present. Not young, not glamorous. Just awake. He noticed. "Nice color," he said, passing by. Just that. 2 words. But I felt them. I started baking again. Muffins, mostly. Just enough for the house. My husband said they were fine. The boy said, "You used lemon zest, right? That's smart. Cuts the sweetness." He smiled when he said it. A real smile. Like he meant it. That evening, I caught myself humming in the kitchen. The window was open. A breeze carried in the scent of jasmine. I felt light. And terrified. Because something was shifting. I didn't know what, not yet. But I knew I was standing near a line. And I didn't know what would happen if I crossed it. Not yet. But I would. The morning after felt like it belonged to someone else. I moved through it in slow motion, a silent observer of my own life. The kettle hissed. The toast popped. The fridge buzzed faintly, its door left ajar for longer than necessary. I went through the motions as if scripted, opening cupboards, pouring tea, placing a single slice of toast on a plate, but none of it felt real. Everything inside me was caught somewhere between shame and something I didn't dare name. He wasn't in the kitchen. I half expected him to appear, to say something light and easy, the way he always did, but maybe he was avoiding me. And why wouldn't he? I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror that morning. I'd tried. I stood in front of it for a long time, towel wrapped tightly around me again, like the night before, staring into the eyes of a woman I didn't quite recognize. Not because she had changed, but because she had been seen, truly seen, and that vision had unsettled everything. It would have been easier if I could pretend the moment in the hallway hadn't happened. But I couldn't. And later that afternoon, when I heard soft steps on the stairs and his voice careful, hesitant, asking if I had that book I'd mentioned the other day, I knew he wasn't pretending either. I invited him in. It was nothing. Or so I told myself. A cup of tea. A casual chat about a book. But the room felt warmer. The couch felt too small. My breathing felt too loud. He sat at the edge of the armchair, mug balanced between his fingers. I sat across from him, legs crossed, hands wrapped around my own cup like armor. I couldn't look at him for too long. Every time I did, something pulled at me. Not lust, not even longing. Just that dangerous awareness again. That buzzing electricity of being acknowledged, being noticed. I had forgotten the shape of it. We talked about books, authors we liked, stories that stayed with us. He told me about a character he had drawn once, a woman with tired eyes and a sad smile. I asked if she was based on someone real. He didn't answer immediately. Just looked at me for a moment too long, and then said, maybe. I laughed to break the silence. Not because it was funny, but because I was scared of what would happen if I let that silence stretch any further. Then he stood up. Said thank you. Said the tea was perfect. And I followed him to the door, out of habit, not out of need. He turned to say goodbye, and that's when it happened. We were too close. Neither of us stepped back. His hand brushed mine as he handed back the empty cup. And for a second, just 1 second, I stopped thinking. We kissed. Not out of passion. Not out of desire. Out of confusion. Out of loneliness. Out of something deep and unspoken that had been building quietly in the spaces between words and glances and paused conversations. The moment ended as quickly as it began. I pulled back, my cheeks flushed, my breath caught in my throat. He looked as stunned as I felt. No apologies were spoken. None needed. The silence was enough. It screamed with meaning. He stepped away first. Down the hall, up the stairs, and then, nothing. Just the distant creak of floorboards and a door closing. I stood at the threshold of the living room, the cup still in my hand. My heart beat too loud in my ears. I looked down and realized I'd chipped one of my nails gripping the porcelain too tightly. That night, I couldn't eat. I picked at dinner while my husband recounted something from work, a meeting, or maybe a client complaint I couldn't follow. I nodded when appropriate. Smiled when expected. But I wasn't there. Not really. When he reached across the table to touch my hand, I pulled back instinctively. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to react. That was our way, smooth surfaces, no ripples. In bed, he turned his back to me again. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the kiss. Every second. Every breath. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't even know if it meant anything to him. Maybe it was just a mistake. A moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Not for me. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to leave my room. I pretended to clean the closet, rearranged dresses I never wore anymore. I lingered over a scarf I used to love, soft silk with a subtle floral pattern. I held it up to the light, watching the colors shift. It reminded me of a version of myself I had lost. By late afternoon, I heard him leave the house. The door closed gently, always gently, he never slammed things. I looked out the window, saw him walking down the path with a sketchpad under his arm. I wondered what he'd draw that day. If he'd draw her again, the woman with the tired eyes. I sat by the window for a long time. Waiting. For what, I didn't know. Maybe for guilt to settle. Maybe for clarity. Maybe for something to tell me how to feel. It never came. Instead, I brewed another cup of tea, took it to the living room, and sat where he had sat the day before. I held the mug the same way he had. Tried to see things from his perspective. The fireplace. The shelves. The fading light from the window. It all felt different now. Tainted and electric. When my husband came home that evening, he kissed my forehead. I flinched. Just slightly. He didn't comment. We ate in silence. The television murmured in the background. He laughed at something, then looked at me expectantly. I smiled. He turned back to the screen, satisfied. Later, as I undressed for bed, I caught my reflection again. And this time, I didn't see a stranger. I saw a woman teetering on a cliff's edge. A woman who had tasted something she hadn't asked for, and now couldn't ignore. I turned out the light. Closed my eyes. Tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. And I had the unsettling feeling that all of this, was only the beginning. The following days passed in uneven rhythm, like a song I couldn't quite follow. I tried to return to normal, or at least a version of it that I could still wear convincingly. I cooked. I answered emails. I watered the plants in the back porch. I filled the house with routine like someone pouring buckets of water over an invisible fire, hoping the smoke would stop giving me away. But the smoke was still there. I felt it every time I crossed paths with him in the hallway, the way we both paused ever so slightly, not out of guilt, but out of some shared uncertainty we couldn't speak aloud. His eyes never lingered too long, and he never brought up the moment. Neither did I. But it lived with us, between us, like a shadow you learn to step around, but never stop seeing. My husband didn't notice anything unusual. Or if he did, he buried it quickly beneath weather updates and news articles. He went through his mornings with the same efficiency as ever, sipping coffee while scrolling headlines, asking about the dry cleaning without looking up. He had no idea that while he read about political tensions overseas, I was sitting at the table across from him, feeling as if my skin belonged to someone else now. I tried, I really did, to lean back into him. One night I stood behind him while he brushed his teeth, reached out to rest a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, not unkindly, just startled. I smiled and said it was nothing, turned away before he could ask. That evening, I found myself standing by the window in the guest room, the one we'd given to him. He wasn't inside. The bed was neatly made. A pair of shoes rested beside it, clean, casual. On the desk, a sketchbook sat closed, the corner of a page curling ever so slightly. I stepped closer, but didn't touch it. Something about that book felt like sacred ground. His space was neat but lived in. It didn't feel temporary. It felt chosen. I thought about how much time I'd spent in my own home without really seeing it. Without noticing the color of the curtains, the way the afternoon light hit the wooden floors, the creak in the hallway just before the stairwell. He had noticed those things. He had drawn them, I was certain. Just as he had drawn me, not in lines or shapes, but in the way he watched. The next morning, I baked. Not for anyone in particular. I just needed to do something with my hands. Something warm and repetitive. I made cranberry scones, the kind I used to bring to my mother on Sunday mornings. The smell filled the kitchen quickly, butter and citrus and flour blending into something that felt almost like comfort. I arranged a few on a small plate and carried them to the backyard, not thinking, just moving. He was there, sketching as usual, seated at the wooden bench near the garden beds. He looked up when he saw me approaching, and something unreadable flickered across his face. I held out the plate without speaking. He took it gently. I sat beside him, a safe distance, not touching. The silence settled between us like the morning dew, quiet, not uncomfortable. I asked what he was drawing. He turned the sketchbook slightly, not enough for me to see. "It's not done," he said, voice soft. I nodded, pretending I didn't feel the tension ripple beneath his words. We didn't speak much after that. I watched the wind move through the leaves. He sketched in silence. When I stood to leave, he said thank you for the scones, not the company. But his eyes said more. His eyes said everything. That night, I didn't dream. I just lay awake, listening to the house breathe. The refrigerator clicked. The heater groaned. Somewhere upstairs, a board creaked, maybe from footsteps, maybe not. The darkness felt like a confession. The next day brought an ordinary routine. I returned books to the library. Bought groceries. Avoided looking at mirrors. When I returned, my husband was in the garage, working on something with the car. He asked if I could bring him a glass of water. I did, placing it beside him without meeting his gaze. I went inside and stood in the hallway for a long time, uncertain where to go. My feet carried me to the living room. The book he had lent me, the one from our first real conversation, still sat on the coffee table. I picked it up and turned to a page I hadn't marked. A line stood out. Sometimes we don't fall in love with people. Sometimes we fall into them, like open doors we didn't expect. I closed the book. My hands trembled. I set it down and went to the kitchen, started scrubbing the sink, violently, pointlessly. That evening, he left the house briefly. I heard the door open and shut, footsteps fading down the path. Without thinking, I went to his room again. The door was open. Inside, a new sketch lay on the desk. This one I could see clearly. A woman, seated at a table, looking out a window. Her face partially turned, but her expression unmistakable, a mix of longing and restraint. She looked like me. I didn't touch the paper. I just stood there, breathing shallowly, heart heavy. When I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room, a scarf. My scarf. The silk one with the floral pattern. I had thought I lost it months ago. He must have found it somewhere, or maybe I'd left it in the living room, and he picked it up. But he hadn't returned it. He had folded it neatly and placed it in the corner of his bookshelf, like something too delicate to disturb. I stepped back, closed the door quietly behind me, and retreated to the kitchen. I poured a glass of wine but didn't drink it. My hands wrapped around the stem like it might ground me. That night, at dinner, my husband commented on the roast. "You used rosemary this time," he said. I nodded. Just felt like something different. He smiled faintly. "It's nice. You should do that more often." We didn't talk about anything else. After he went to bed, I remained at the table, fingers tracing invisible circles on the surface. I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince anymore, him, myself, or the boy upstairs, that none of this meant anything. But deep down, I already knew the truth. It meant everything. I woke the next morning to the sound of birds, though I couldn't say if they'd always been that loud or if I'd simply never noticed. The sunlight crept across the hardwood floor in slow golden stripes, catching the dust in the air like glitter frozen in time. Everything looked the same, but something in me had shifted. There was a subtle tightness in my chest, like holding a secret between clenched teeth. My husband had already left for work. His mug was in the sink, ringed with cold coffee, and a folded newspaper lay half-read on the table. I moved through the kitchen without touching any of it. The quiet felt different now, not lonely, but loaded, as if the silence had things to say if I stopped long enough to listen. Later that day, I stood outside on the back patio with pruning shears in hand, pretending to tend to the plants. I trimmed the roses, though they didn't need it. I watered the herbs, though the soil was still damp. I just needed something for my hands to do, anything to distract from the way my mind kept circling the same images, his face, his drawings, the scarf I'd found folded with such care. I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me and turned to find him standing there, a rolled canvas under his arm, paint smudged along the side of his hand. He nodded, not speaking, as if words were unnecessary. I stepped aside so he could pass, and for a moment, as we stood side by side on the narrow path, neither of us moved. Then he walked on. It was a small moment. Barely even a moment. But I felt it, that familiar shift in the air, that sense of something almost happening and then not. It was the in-between that unsettled me most. The not knowing. The almosts. In the afternoon, I took a walk. I hadn't done that in a while, just walked, without errands, without purpose. I wandered the neighborhood, eyes on the sidewalk, occasionally glancing up at windows and fences and front doors, wondering if anyone else felt like a ghost in their own life. I passed a woman walking her dog, a man raking leaves, a group of teenagers laughing too loudly. I envied their simplicity, their noise, their clarity. When I returned, I found a folded note on the kitchen counter. It was short, barely 2 sentences. Just a thank you for the scones, for the book, for the conversation. No signature, but none was needed. I read it twice, then tucked it into the drawer beside the cookbooks, beneath a pad of unused grocery lists. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He said there had been traffic, but I noticed the tired way he moved, the way he rubbed the bridge of his nose while reading emails on his phone. I asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. Then he asked if I'd seen his gray sweater. I had. It was in the laundry basket. I told him I'd wash it in the morning. He nodded and disappeared upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the last bit of light filtering through the curtains. The days were getting shorter. The shadows longer. After dinner, he fell asleep in the recliner, the television casting flickering light across his face. I watched him for a moment. His mouth was slightly open, breath slow and steady. He looked older in sleep, softer somehow. I wondered if he still dreamed about me. I wondered when I stopped dreaming about him. The next morning, I found the scarf missing from the guest room. I didn't ask about it. I didn't need to. It was a quiet Sunday. My husband spent most of it fixing a broken hinge on the bathroom door. I offered to help, and he waved me off with a distracted smile. I watched him work for a while, then retreated to the living room. The book was still on the coffee table. I picked it up, flipped through pages, stopping on a sentence I'd underlined weeks ago. The spaces we inhabit become echoes of the lives we don't speak aloud. That line lingered in my mind as I moved through the rest of the day. In the early evening, I went out to water the garden. I didn't expect him to be there, but he was seated cross-legged near the rose bushes, a notebook balanced on his knee. He looked up when he heard the hose, then backed down without saying anything. I turned off the water. I wanted to say something. I didn't. Instead, I stepped onto the path and walked toward the gate. Just before I passed him, he spoke. "You changed something," he said, not looking at me. I paused. "What do you mean?" He turned the notebook slightly, showing me a quick sketch, the kitchen window, open, curtain fluttering. "You used to keep it closed." I looked at the page. It was just a window, but somehow, it felt like more. I nodded once, then kept walking. That night, I sat at my vanity, brushing my hair out slowly, watching the strands catch the lamplight. I remembered doing this as a younger woman, not for anyone, just for the quiet ritual of it. Back then, I had felt more in my body, more certain of the space I took up. Now, it felt like I was relearning how to inhabit my own skin. My husband came in, kissed the top of my head. I flinched again, though not as sharply as before. He asked if I was coming to bed. I told him I'd be there soon. When he left, I sat in the chair for a long time, staring at my reflection. Not judging. Just observing. Outside, the wind picked up. I heard it whistle through the gaps in the windowpane. It sounded like a sigh, long and slow. Something was changing. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it rising like a tide. I knew there was still time to turn back. But part of me wasn't sure I wanted to. And that terrified me more than anything else. The weather turned colder overnight, as if the seasons themselves had decided to reflect my shifting state of mind. I woke up earlier than usual and stood at the window, watching frost settle over the lawn in delicate, white filigree. The street was still and silent, the world not quite awake. I found peace in that pause, the brief space before motion returned. Downstairs, the house was as quiet as ever. My husband had already left for the office. A half-eaten piece of toast rested beside the sink, crumbs scattered like the aftermath of a hurried goodbye. I swept them up carefully, not out of cleanliness but to fill the empty moments. I lingered in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold too quickly. My eyes kept drifting to the back door. Something about that morning felt like an invitation, not from anyone, just from the quiet. The kind of quiet that dares you to do something uncharacteristic. I changed into a soft gray sweater and jeans, nothing unusual, but I added a scarf, the floral one I thought I'd lost and now knew I hadn't. I tied it loosely, the ends falling over my chest like bookmarks, marking a chapter one hadn't meant to open. I found him outside, seated on the low wooden bench near the roses, a sketchpad in his lap, pencil moving in steady lines. He didn't look up when I approached. I didn't speak. I sat down beside him, leaving a respectable space between us, and folded my hands in my lap. The garden was silent except for the occasional rustle of a breeze through brittle leaves. A squirrel darted along the fence. Somewhere beyond the backyard, a dog barked once, then fell quiet again. I asked what he was drawing. He didn't answer immediately. Then he tilted the sketchpad so I could see. It was a window, not just any window, I realized. It was mine. The one in the kitchen. The curtains were drawn open, the table behind it empty, but there was something in the shading that made it feel occupied. I didn't know what to say. The image held more truth than any words could. He flipped the page and began a new one. I watched his hand move, the way his fingers adjusted the pencil, the light pressure at first, then firmer strokes. The act of creation seemed to calm him. Or maybe it calmed me. I let my gaze fall away, studying the frost still clinging to the rose leaves. They were withering now, curling inward, turning brittle. But still beautiful. I wasn't sure how long we sat there. The sun shifted. The air warmed. Eventually, I stood. He looked up, just briefly, and nodded once. No words. But something passed between us in that glance, something weightier than conversation. I returned to the house and closed the door quietly behind me. My hands trembled slightly. I placed them against the countertop, grounding myself, breathing through the weight of emotion pressing against my chest. It wasn't love, what I was feeling. It wasn't lust. It was something harder to name, a reawakening, maybe, or the ache of being truly present for the first time in years. I spent the rest of the day moving through the house like someone walking through a museum of their own life. Every room held echoes. Every item on a shelf, every photo in a frame, whispered something. A younger version of me looked out from the wedding picture on the mantel. She was laughing, head tilted back, her eyes locked on a man holding her waist like she might disappear. That man was still here, still mine. But the space between us had grown so quietly, I hadn't noticed until it was too wide to cross without falling. That evening, I prepared dinner slowly. I roasted vegetables, made rice with fresh herbs, seared salmon the way he liked. When my husband came home, he seemed surprised by the effort. "It smells like a restaurant in here," he said, removing his coat. "What's the occasion?" "Just felt like cooking properly," I replied. My voice was even. My hands didn't tremble. We ate at the table. We talked about neutral things. Work. Weather. A neighbor who had repainted their fence. He complimented the food, even reached for my hand briefly, mid-meal. His fingers were warm, familiar. I didn't pull away. After dinner, he turned on the television and I cleared the plates. He called out something about a documentary, asked if I wanted to join. I said I would be up soon. I didn't go. Instead, I stood at the sink, washing dishes slowly, watching the water swirl down the drain. My mind replayed the morning, the sketch, the silence, the space that had existed without needing to be filled. And the feeling that had settled into me since, not guilt, not regret, but something far more dangerous, longing. When I finally made my way upstairs, he was already asleep on the couch, head tilted awkwardly, a blanket pulled halfway over him. I stood there for a moment, considering waking him, offering him the comfort of the bed. But I didn't. I simply turned off the television, adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, and walked away. The house was cold that night. I pulled the covers tight around me and listened to the wind outside. I thought about how many moments in life come and go without us realizing they were doors. Doors we walked past. Doors we never opened. Doors we opened without meaning to. This one had creaked open softly, letting in something quiet but undeniable. And now I couldn't unsee what had come through. I closed my eyes. Sleep did not come easily. But the image of the window stayed with me, not the real one, but the one he had drawn. Empty, yet alive. Open, but not unguarded. Just like me. The morning began with a sense of weight I couldn't immediately name. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the slow drip of the faucet, my fingers wrapped around a mug I hadn't sipped from in over 10 minutes. Outside, the frost had melted overnight, replaced by a pale dampness that made everything look unfinished, the sky, the grass, even the light. He hadn't come down yet. I knew because I listened. I had developed a strange sensitivity to the sounds of the house, as if the creak of a stair or the turn of a faucet upstairs could somehow reveal the state of his thoughts. It was absurd, but it had become part of my mornings, this waiting for a sound that would tell me he was awake, that he was still here. My husband had left early again. He'd kissed my cheek out of habit, not attention. I hadn't said anything. There was no confrontation between us, no rupture. Just a quiet erosion that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I wondered if that made us weak or merely practiced in the art of self-deception. Later that morning, I found a slip of paper folded neatly on the kitchen table. It wasn't addressed to me, and it wasn't hidden, just left there, open in its presence, but closed in intention. I didn't unfold it at first. I just stared at the clean crease, the faint indentation of writing pressing through from the inside. My fingers hovered. Then finally, gently, I opened it. There were no names, no greetings. Just a few lines, written in a handwriting that was now unmistakably his. I don't know what this is. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to write it down so I wouldn't carry it alone. That was it. No signature. No explanation. But it said more than enough. I folded the paper and placed it back where I found it. I didn't take it with me. I didn't hide it. I left it there, exposed and untouched, because anything else would have been too much. That afternoon, I decided to clean the hall closet. Not because it needed it, but because I didn't know what else to do. The repetitive motion of folding, sorting, wiping, it quieted something in me. I found old scarves I had forgotten about, a pair of gloves with a broken seam, a box of faded birthday cards from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Objects with no present, only past. As I knelt on the floor, sorting through a tangle of shoelaces and hats, I heard movement behind me. I didn't turn right away. I knew it was him. There was a softness in the way he moved that didn't belong to anyone else in this house. "I didn't mean for you to read it," he said quietly. I stayed on the floor, back turned to him. "You left it in the middle of the table." He didn't respond. I could feel the tension between us vibrating in the silence. "I'm not angry," I added. "But maybe we should stop pretending this is nothing." More silence. Then the soft scuff of his shoes on the hardwood as he stepped back. I didn't look at him as he left. I couldn't. That evening, I made soup. Simple, clean. Carrots, celery, broth. The kind of meal people make when they need to be grounded. My husband came home late again. He apologized, but not with guilt, just fatigue. We ate in near silence. The television buzzed quietly in the background, some news anchor's voice filling the space we couldn't. He complimented the soup. I nodded. He asked if I wanted to watch a movie later. I said maybe. After dinner, he sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I sat across from him, folding a blanket for no reason. I watched the way his face lit up briefly with the glow of the screen, then dimmed again. We were two people occupying the same space, but not the same life. When I went upstairs, I didn't go to bed immediately. I stopped by the guest room. The door was open, but he wasn't inside. The room was tidy. The bed made. A sketchbook rested on the desk, closed. I stood in the doorway for a long time, not crossing the threshold. Then I turned and went to my room. Sleep didn't come easily. It hadn't for weeks. My mind had become a reel of half-formed thoughts, unfinished scenes, things I should have said and didn't. I lay on my side, facing the window, watching the branches outside sway in the wind like they were trying to shake something off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I held my breath. They paused outside my door. Then moved on. The next morning, I didn't speak much. Neither did anyone else. The quiet had settled deeper now, not tense, but thick, like fog you could taste. I baked a batch of muffins, then left them on the counter without a note. I didn't wait to see who would eat them. By late afternoon, I realized something had shifted. Not between me and him, but within me. The feeling I had been trying to deny had grown too large to ignore. Not just attraction, not even longing, but awareness. Of myself. Of my own hunger. Of my own presence in a life I had sleepwalked through for too long. And I understood something, finally. This wasn't about him. Not really. It was about me. It was about wanting to be seen. Not admired. Not needed. Just seen. Truly. Fully. Like a person who still existed. Like someone who hadn't disappeared beneath chores and silence and the passing of years. That night, I stood at the kitchen window again. The same one he had drawn. It was dark outside, my reflection faint in the glass. I touched the sill gently, then opened it, letting in the night air. It was cold. But it was real. Behind me, the house was quiet. But I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel invisible. Not tonight. The air felt heavier that morning, as if the house had absorbed all the unspoken things between its walls and didn't know how to hold them anymore. I walked barefoot across the cold kitchen tiles, every step strangely grounding. There was something final about the way the sunlight hit the counter that day, soft, golden, yet cold at the edges, like a memory that still hurts to hold. My husband had left early again, a growing habit that neither of us commented on. His absence no longer created space. It created stillness. Not peace. Just the soundless weight of what had not been said. I cleaned. More than usual. Not out of necessity, but out of restlessness. I wiped surfaces already clean, reorganized the spice rack, ironed pillowcases no one would notice. I didn't want to think. I didn't want to feel the ache that had settled somewhere deep in my chest, the one that no amount of routine could silence. I avoided going outside until well past noon, when the sun had climbed enough to melt the thin veil of frost on the back patio. I carried a blanket with me, one I hadn't used in months, and a thermos of coffee that was mostly an excuse to keep my hands busy. He was already out there, seated at the far end of the garden, where the shadows from the trees formed a kind of natural barrier between him and the world. He looked up when I approached, but said nothing. Neither did I. I sat beside him, the blanket folded over my lap, and offered him a cup from the thermos. He accepted it without a word, his fingers brushing mine in the exchange. That brief touch felt louder than anything we might have said. For a while, we just sat like that, two people sharing space, silence, and something nameless that neither dared to label. The only sound was the occasional rustle of branches, the soft creak of wood beneath the bench, and the faint clink of ceramic against the thermos lid. Eventually, he reached into his bag and pulled out his sketchbook. He opened it slowly, flipping past pages filled with half-finished drawings, windows, chairs, the curve of a doorframe, the shadow of a bookshelf, all familiar and not. Then he stopped on one and turned it toward me. It was a drawing of the kitchen table. Not the table as it was now, but how it looked in the mornings, with my mug, the folded newspaper, the fruit bowl I kept refilling out of habit. In the corner, barely sketched, was the curve of a shoulder. Mine, I realized. A small suggestion of presence, not full, but real. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He looked at me, eyes soft, not expectant. Just open. I folded the blanket across my lap, fingers twisting its edge. I was suddenly aware of the way my hair fell over my collarbone, the way the fabric of my sweater clung to the bend of my shoulder. I wasn't trying to be seen. But I was. And I couldn't pretend otherwise. We didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, I stood, careful not to spill the thermos or disturb the balance of that moment. He stood too. Our eyes met, not deeply, not searchingly, just long enough to acknowledge what was already happening. We kissed. There was no hesitation. No second guessing. Just a quiet surrender to something that had been rising between us for weeks. And then, as quickly as it had started, it ended. He stepped back. I lowered my gaze. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I returned to the house, my breath caught somewhere between my throat and my stomach. I didn't look behind me. I didn't check if he had followed. I didn't want to break the stillness that had settled over me like snow. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer than it should have. I opened a window. Let the cold in. The rest of the day passed in slow, deliberate motion. I folded laundry, answered a few emails, rearranged the bookshelf for no particular reason. Every task felt like part of a ritual I didn't remember inventing. By the time my husband returned home, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long, amber shadows across the floor. He greeted me with a tired smile, and I offered one in return. We exchanged words about dinner, the traffic, something on the news. Nothing was out of place. And yet, everything was different. Later, after we had eaten and the dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, I stood by the kitchen window again, hands resting on the cool surface of the countertop. I could see the backyard from there, the bench barely visible in the gathering dark. He hadn't come back out after the kiss. Or maybe he had, and I hadn't seen. Or maybe it didn't matter. My husband entered the room behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist in a gesture that felt too practiced. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. He kissed the back of my neck, murmured something about how good the house smelled lately. I smiled without showing my teeth. That night, in bed, he reached for me. I let him. His hands moved with the rhythm of familiarity, of routine, not of curiosity or desire. I closed my eyes and allowed it, not out of love or obligation, but because it felt like something I owed to him, to myself, to the version of me who had once only wanted to be wanted. When it was over, he fell asleep quickly, breathing deep and even beside me. I stared at the ceiling for hours. The kiss haunted me. Not for what it meant, but for what it didn't. It hadn't been a spark, or a jolt, or the crossing of a forbidden line. It had been a confirmation of something I already knew. That the life I'd built piece by piece, day by day, no longer fit. Not because of him, but because of me. I had changed. And I didn't know yet what to do with that truth. There was a strange clarity the morning after. I moved through the house with a stillness that surprised me, not the nervous kind, not regretful either, but quiet, deliberate. Like something had settled. Like something inside me had accepted what had already happened and stopped fighting it. I noticed things I hadn't seen in weeks. The way the morning light curled along the wall in the hallway. The faint hum of the refrigerator as I passed the kitchen. The small chip on the corner of the tiled floor, had that always been there? Everything felt sharper, more present, as if the world had decided to reveal itself just as I had been doing the opposite for so long. The bench in the garden was empty. He wasn't there. I waited through my coffee, but the door upstairs never opened. I told myself it didn't matter. That what happened yesterday had been just a moment. But my body betrayed me, the way I turned toward the sound of any footstep, the way I paused by the window every few minutes, the way I couldn't bring myself to sit on that same bench. It wasn't just a moment. Not for me. By midday, I gave up pretending to be busy. I stood in front of the living room bookshelf, tracing my fingers along the spines of novels I used to love. I pulled one at random and flipped through the pages. I didn't read a word. I only listened to the silence, to the way the house seemed to hold its breath. That's when I heard the front door open. Not the creak of the back gate or the soft shift of footsteps on gravel. The front door. I peeked through the hallway just in time to see my husband entering, his face unusually serious. He held something in his hand, a travel mug, the kind I knew didn't belong to either of us. It was his. The boys. He didn't say anything at first. He walked to the kitchen and placed the mug on the counter, his eyes lingering on it for a second longer than necessary. Then he turned toward me, and I saw it, the pause in his movement, the small tension in his brow, the quiet alertness of someone who knew more than they let on. He didn't confront me. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he said, "Found it in the driveway this morning. Near the fence." I nodded slowly. My throat was dry. "He must have dropped it," I said. "Maybe," my husband replied, and his tone held no anger. Just observation. Just the weight of a thought he wasn't ready to share. That night, he didn't eat much. Neither did I. We sat across from each other at the table, and the conversation was light, weather, emails, weekend plans. But beneath it ran something deeper, something too subtle to name. A quiet question: who are we, and how did we get here? After dinner, he offered to make tea. I declined and went upstairs. My feet carried me not to our bedroom, but to the guest room, the one that no longer held his presence. The bed was made. The sketchbook was gone. The walls felt emptier than they had in weeks. I opened the window and looked out into the night. No lights in the garden. No movement. Only the wind rustling faintly through the leaves and the soft creak of a branch outside. I stayed like that for a long time. Not crying. Not panicking. Just standing still in the place where something had ended, or maybe paused. The next morning brought no answers. But the mug was still on the counter. I left it there. Days began to blur. He didn't come back. There was no note, no message, no closure. Only absence. And in that absence, I began to notice my husband more, not because he was suddenly different, but because I had been looking through him for so long. I watched the way he poured his coffee, the way he checked his reflection in the window before leaving, the way he stared at the television without seeing it. One evening, he stood by the window longer than usual. I was behind him, folding laundry, and I could feel something in the air, hesitation, maybe. Or restraint. Then he asked, "Are you happy?" The question struck harder than anything else could have. Not because I didn't know the answer. But because I wasn't sure how to say it without breaking something. I didn't respond right away. I folded another shirt. Smoothed the fabric. "I don't know," I said finally. "I think I forgot how to tell." He nodded, but didn't turn around. I watched his shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. Then he left the room. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after he went to bed. I opened a drawer and found the note, the one I'd read days ago, the one left by someone who hadn't asked for anything but space to feel. I unfolded it. Read the words again. This time, they hurt in a different way. Not because of him. But because I had done the same thing for years, carried everything silently, hoping someone else would feel it through the way I moved, the way I disappeared into tasks, into silence. In the morning, I made breakfast. Toast. Eggs. Coffee. He joined me without a word. We ate slowly. Like people sharing something neither wanted to name. Then, as he stood to leave for work, he paused by the sink. Rested his hand on the counter beside the mug. Not touching it. Just near it. Then he looked at me. "I'll be home late," he said. I nodded. He walked to the door, then hesitated. "Do you need anything?" he asked, his voice quieter. I shook my head. He left. The door closed. And the mug stayed right where it was. Unclaimed. Waiting. Like a truth no one wanted to say out loud. The days began to take on a strange stillness. Not the kind of silence that suffocates, but the kind that feels like an aftershock, a pause after something has cracked, but before anyone decides what to do with the pieces. The mug stayed on the counter, untouched. A small, quiet monument to everything we didn't say. I found myself avoiding the kitchen more than usual. I made coffee in the den. I folded laundry in the guest room. I took long walks without a destination. Every time I passed that mug, something in my chest tightened, not guilt exactly, but a tender sort of ache that sat in my ribs like a memory too fresh to name. I started watching the backyard again. The bench. The garden. The way the light moved across the lawn. I told myself I wasn't looking for him, but I knew better. I expected nothing. But part of me still waited. My husband grew quieter. Not in an angry way, just careful. His movements were slower, his glances more frequent. As if he was watching me out of the corner of his mind, trying to calculate what had changed, but afraid to do the math aloud. We lived in a house of mutual hesitation. Nothing said. Everything felt. One evening, I stood in front of the hallway mirror and stared at my reflection for a long time. The woman looking back at me didn't look dramatically different than she had a month ago. Her face was the same. Her lines. Her posture. But something had shifted in her eyes, not hardness, not sadness, but a kind of sober clarity. A sense that she had crossed a distance and wasn't sure what was waiting on the other side. That night, I sat on the living room floor with a stack of photo albums. My husband passed by, paused, and asked if I needed help. I said no. He nodded and kept walking. I opened the first album and saw us as younger, louder, unaware of what years could do. I traced my finger over a picture from a beach trip. We were both squinting against the sun, my arm slung over his shoulder, his hand resting on my knee. We looked like people who belonged to each other. But time had frayed that thread. Not broken it, just worn it so thin it didn't hold weight the same way. I closed the album and sat in the dark for a while. The next morning, I found the mug had been moved. Just slightly. A few inches to the left. It was subtle, so subtle I questioned whether I had imagined its original position. But I hadn't. I knew it by heart now. That slight shift was not accidental. And it changed everything. Later that day, my husband walked into the kitchen while I was watering the plants by the window. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes steady. He didn't speak right away. I didn't prompt him. Finally, he said, "I think I already know. I just need to hear it from you." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was just tired. I turned off the tap. The soil in the pot was already soaked. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, took a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I didn't plan it," I said. "I know. It wasn't physical. Not in the way you think." He nodded. Slowly. Like he had been preparing himself for that sentence, yet still felt its weight when it arrived. "Do you love him?" he asked. I shook my head. No. It wasn't about him. That answer seemed to land somewhere unexpected. He looked at me, really looked, as if for the first time in years, and said, "Then what was it about?" I hesitated. And then I said the thing I had been too afraid to say for so long. It was about being seen. He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, silent, and for a moment I thought he might walk out of the room without another word. But instead, he stepped forward, placed both hands flat on the counter, and asked quietly, "Do you still want this? Us?" I wanted to answer immediately. I wanted to reassure him, to fix everything with a simple yes. But I couldn't. Because I didn't know. "I don't know," I said. "I'm sorry. I just don't know." He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He just nodded, once. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen. That night, he didn't sleep in our bed. He didn't say he wouldn't. He didn't announce a decision. But his pillow remained untouched, and the guest room door was closed. I sat alone in the bedroom, staring at the ceiling, the same familiar shadows cast by the lamplight stretching across the walls. I listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the cracked window frame, the hum of silence trying to hold its form. Sometime after midnight, I stood and walked downstairs. The mug was gone. I don't know when he took it. Or why. Maybe it was a small gesture of reclaiming space. Or maybe it was a quiet acknowledgement that the story it represented had already ended. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water. The moonlight filtered through the curtains in thin white lines, and for the first time in weeks, I felt no need to move. No need to fix, to explain, to rewrite. The truth had arrived. It hadn't exploded or collapsed anything. It had simply settled, like dust, like fog, like a blanket pulled gently over something that had run its course. In the quiet of that kitchen, I allowed myself to imagine something I hadn't in a long time. A future. Not clear. Not certain. But mine. And maybe that was enough. The house was quiet in a way I hadn't heard before, not just silent, but hollow. Like it had exhaled something it had been holding for too long. I moved through it differently now, more aware of the weight my steps carried, the way the floorboards gave under my heels, the way the air shifted when I passed through a room. I wasn't a ghost here, not anymore. I was something else, not quite whole, not quite broken. Just human, finally. My husband and I spoke less, but the silence no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like pause. Like something stretching, not snapping. We passed each other gently in hallways, made coffee at different times, folded laundry in separate rooms. There was space now. Not distance. Space. And there's a difference. That weekend, I found the guest room empty, not in the way it had been before, but emptier somehow. Stripped of lingering presence. No sketchbooks. No sweater left on the chair. The window was open slightly, and a breeze lifted the curtain just enough to make the room feel like it had never been touched at all. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, letting memory press softly against me. I didn't step inside. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, opened the top drawer, and pulled out the note I hadn't dared throw away. The same one. Folds a little softer now, ink still clear. I didn't read it this time. I just held it in my hand and thought about all the things I never wrote back. Later that afternoon, I packed a bag. Not to leave. Not permanently. Just to go. I didn't tell my husband until after dinner. We were both washing dishes, moving in practiced rhythm. He passed me a damp plate to dry, and I said, softly, I think I need a few days. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask where. He only nodded and said, okay. And in that okay was everything, understanding, fatigue, release. I left the next morning. A small suitcase. One sweater too many. No real plan, just a destination 2 towns over, a quiet coastal place with old porches and wind-worn railings and the kind of light that doesn't ask anything from you. I checked into a small inn. The woman at the desk handed me a brass key and said, Room 3, you'll like the window. She was right. It faced the ocean. That first night, I sat on the bed, curled around a cup of tea, and allowed myself to not be anything for anyone. Not a wife. Not a woman in the middle of undoing. Just a person with a name and a room key and a chance to sit in her own skin without apology. I walked the beach every morning. Shoes in hand, jeans rolled, sand cold between my toes. I watched the tide move in, move out, return again, without anger, without regret. Just return. It became a kind of prayer. I wrote a little in a notebook I bought from a gas station. Small things. What I ate. The way the light hit the side of the lighthouse near sunset. A description of the woman who sold me coffee, her laugh, her bracelets, her silver braid. Nothing grand. Nothing about him. Nothing about us. Just now. On the third day, I sat at a pier and watched a boy sketching seagulls. His hand moved with ease. Not hurried. Just sure. And I realized, for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the ache anymore. Not the ache of being seen. Not the ache of wanting. Just breath. Just tide. Just sky. I went home the next day. The house looked the same. A little dustier. A few mail envelopes stacked on the counter. But no tension. No surprises. My husband was in the garden, trimming the dead leaves off the hydrangeas. He looked up when I arrived, nodded once, then turned back to his work. Inside, everything was still where I had left it. My scarf on the hook. My book on the table. My world, waiting, but not demanding. That evening, I cooked dinner. A simple one. Nothing heavy. He set the table without speaking. We ate quietly, but the silence didn't ache the way it used to. After the dishes were washed, I stood at the window. He came to stand beside me. We looked out at the dark yard, at the shadows between trees, at the bench that now felt like any other piece of furniture. It no longer held weight. It was just wood. Then he asked, "Do you want to stay?" The question was soft. Not pleading. Not fearful. Just offered. I turned to him and answered, "I want to begin again. I don't know what that means yet. But I want to try." He nodded. That's enough. We didn't hold hands. We didn't touch. We stood there, side by side, breathing into something new. That night, I slept in our bed. I woke before sunrise, and for the first time in what felt like years, I watched the light come in slowly without trying to fix anything. Without trying to name it, or control it, or turn it into a metaphor. It was just light. And I was just me. No longer lost. Not yet healed. But here.